It's really a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you about Ben Graham. I've had some lucky days in my life, but one of the luckiest was in 1949 when I was 19 years old in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I picked up a copy of The Intelligent Investor. It not only changed my investment philosophy, it really changed my whole life. I'd be a different person in a different place if I hadn't have first seen that book. I got a bedrock of investment philosophy that really hasn't changed ever since I read the book. I may embellish on it a little here and there, but it was Ben's ideas that sent me down the right path. And then a year or so later, I very belatedly applied to Columbia University, and Dave Dodd let me in, and I got to know Ben personally when he was my professor in the second semester there. And when I finished up, of course, I said I'd go to work for him for nothing, and he said I was overpriced, and he probably was right. But a few years later, I got a letter from him, and he said, next time you're in New York, I'd like to talk to you. And I made a point of being there about 24 hours later, and he offered me a job. And I didn't ask the salary, but fortunately, at the end of the first month, I found out he'd not taken me, or maybe he'd forgotten about the fact that I'd do it for nothing. And I got inspired working for him, just being around him every day. And then we developed this friendship, which lasted until he died about 25 years later. So I really had a quarter of a century of experience with a marvelous man. And you all know about his mind and his ideas and the influence they've had on the profession of security analysis, the influence they probably had on you and your own portfolios, and certainly me. But the human side was just as impressive. He was a generous man. When my first son was born, shortly after I went back to take the job in December of 1954, my son was born, and I gave him the middle name of Graham. I named him after my dad, Howard, and then after Ben Graham with the middle name of Graham. And Ben came over to our apartment in White Plains and gave me a camera and a movie projector. It was a lot different doing that sort of thing in those days. And so I could record what was happening with Howard Graham Buffett from virtually the moment he was born. A little later, I think my wife had said something to him about my lack of dancing ability or something, which was well justified. And Ben gave me a certificate for some free lessons at the Arthur Murray Dance Studio in White Plains. That may have been the worst investment he ever made. It was he did not get his money's worth when he did that.
We sat in on part of a seminar at the Graduate School of Business at Columbia University. After all, it's older than the stock exchange. And we thought professors familiar with the language of the street might treat the market with detachment. Dean Courtney Brown and Professor Benjamin Graham were instructing future brokers and customers' men.
The explanation cannot be found in any mathematics, but it has to be found in investor psychology. You can have an extraordinary difference in the price level merely because not only speculators, but investors themselves are looking at the situation through rose-colored glasses rather than dark blue glasses.
Well, some observers from time to time say that the stock market is a forecaster of events to come. Can you predict, or would you care to take a look at what you think this might be forecasting, the decline?
The stock market has been a good forecaster from time to time in the past. It also has been a rather poor forecaster occasionally. For example, the last 4 or 5 years, the stock market has been booming along and presumably forecasting better business, which has really not materialized. Corporate profits are not any better than they were 5 years ago, but stock prices are 50% higher or thereabouts. So maybe the stock market is really correcting a previous incorrect forecast this time rather than making a new correct one.
Many of you manage money. He was managing money for people, and they were disappointed with what had happened. But he could see far enough out in the future that he still turned out this marvelous book in a dispassionate, very rational way, and not overwhelmed by the events of the previous couple of years. But he wrote a book where 75 or so years later, we're still reading it to learn new things every day. So it was a marvelous intellectual achievement. But But again, he couldn't help that. He was born with that brain. He didn't have to be the wonderful human being he was. I mean, he could have behaved in an arrogant manner or had a tone of superiority because he had to know he was smarter than 99.99% of the people around him. But he wasn't that kind of a person at all. He treated all of us students, came up to Columbia on a Thursday for 20 or 25 years just to help out a bunch of students that he might never see again, that weren't going to do anything for him. He was sharing knowledge that, in effect, was going to make them competitors. I bought some of the same stocks that Graham Newman was buying, his investment company, later on. I didn't buy them in very big quantities because they didn't have that kind of money. But he was creating competitors. It didn't bother him. He used current examples. We would sit there in class, and he would tell us about things that we never would have found on our own. But he was just a generous man in every way, and I was lucky to know him, and I hope you've gotten to know him a little bit through these comments.